So someone wrote, when I presented these statistics last year, what I really found interesting is that 75% of women go through drug and alcohol treatment have been sexually assaulted. You say that you don't have to be a woman to be able to counsel these women. Question, do you feel that counseling that these women receive is effective when counseled by a man? The answer, I think I did answer. And also, do the majority of these women prefer to be counseled by a man or a woman? And another question I have is, individuals with ADHD that are prescribed amphetamines, do they become addicted, or do people with ADHD feel normal when taking these types of drugs? What do you think? First question. Yes?
Not necessarily does a woman have to be sexually assaulted by a man.
Correct. That's right. Yes, we're assuming heteronormative here. Doesn't always work that way.
Unfortunately, it's more the norm that you'll see same sex when it comes to sexual molestation, especially in children.
Yeah, then how do you report that or compensate for that in your therapy if that gets identified? Someone else had a hand up?
Oh, I was thinking about the ADHD.
Okay.
And they're probably conditioned to think that that's their normal, but it's probably, not.
Well, they're certainly conditioned by the drug itself.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Right, so it would depend, the question is it more effective when counseled by a man? Not necessarily. It basically depends on, the training of the man and the approach. Because I basically laid out in the equation what you have to do. I get questioned all the time, well, you're not an addict or alcoholic, how can you help people? Yeah, right. 40 years, I don't have to have done the behavior that you've done. I just have to have seen it like 100 times and talk you out of it. I just have to understand what you're going through. And I see the substance use as a symptom of something else, and I go to the something else first. Which does scare some people because they're not always ready to look at their pain and suffering. It's very threatening. Well, you're the first person. Well, yeah, I was trained to do that because I know what was driving me. So, all right, the professional standard is this. Wherever possible, match a counselor to the client where similarities exist and the client feels safe. Obviously, women counselors with sexual abuse experience matched with women who've been sexually abused would be the best match. But you don't always have those choices. That doesn't always happen. And some clients, and I've had women clients who've preferred male counselors, sometimes because they feel they can manipulate them, but for whatever reason they feel safer or less judged by a man and with women. Now there's another piece to this too. Rape is about power, not sex. So if you've been abused, you recognize power relationships, and you will do whatever you can to survive when you perceive somebody has more power than you. You will manipulate them. I've had some abuse survivors that basically initiate sex. Now with me, boundaries after all. Right? But they will initiate sex to basically feel in control because they've been abused and they want to be in control. All right? So understand what a professional standard means, that you basically are prepared intellectually for whatever is coming at you that is going to be normal, and normal is whatever happens. So whatever characteristics, gay, straight, recovering, of color, poor, disabled, the counselor has to be competent to understand and ask the right questions and know which direction to point the client in, to point the client in a particular direction, whether the client is aware of the issues or not, and whether the client believes there are issues or not. Because some people will basically say, I had a woman client that went through all women rehab 3 times and never disclosed that what was driving her addiction was sexual abuse at the hands of a relative. right? Successfully completed women-only treatment 3 times. Never disclosed sexual abuse until she got to me at LCC. So I'm talking about local treatment without naming names because I'm in a good mood today. So the training says you're supposed to ask them right up front. And how come that didn't get asked?
That's what I'm thinking, because you said a good tip-off is if there's chunks of your childhood that you can't remember.
Right.
So it seems like there would be clues
Mm-hmm.
to the...
Mm-hmm.
And if we're looking at 1 in 6 women, I think there'd be a high chance
I
that
think
counselor...
you would look at that, but okay. So the counselor is supposed to know this regardless of whether they are those particular characteristics. Knowing that statistic drawn from, this is essentially the SHARP unit when that existed in Sacred Heart. I can ask the question of a woman, have you ever been sexually abused, assaulted, or had periods of time from your childhood you don't remember or have traumatic flashbacks during sex? A man can ask these questions appropriately, timing, tone of voice, then they can do the job. So I'm just saying you have to be trained or train yourself. Now remember, this class was adapted from the pro class for civilians. So I'm telling you as civilians, if you become a consumer of counseling services, this is the standard they better be following. And you bring it up if they don't. Because they might be scared, but too bad. This is the thing, the way to get healing. It's about you, not their discomfort, please. They need to be able to go there. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing with you, but also, you're right, they are sometimes unwilling to discuss things like that. You think, why did they become a counselor? And at school, I've had at least 4 classes within criminal justice, human services, where the subject is not to be touched. We're told, and I'm just shocked. I'm like, this should be as common as talking about cancer or something. I mean,
Yeah, it should be.
Very not, uncomfortable. It should just be, so many people have experienced it.
Yeah.
We just admit it and just, people should, but as far as the male counselor and the woman trying to have sex, sometimes mothers who get counseling when their children have been hurt that way will just be looking for, you get a counselor that's a man, you're like, oh my God, he's normal. And you almost like want to fall in love with them because they're just like, God, there really is a normal man out there. And it's not really love. You're just so thankful that there's such a normal person out there. Because you start thinking everybody is weird. And it's really something people go through because you feel so, I can't explain it now, but it goes further than that. But it's just something that does happen.
So, what's the wound? What heals it? So what community, what group of people knows how to heal this particular wound, whatever that wound is? What community doesn't even know the wound exists or is in denial about it? So professionally, from time to time, you have to deal with people you may not personally like or may not personally like you. So you still have to deliver the best service you know how. So, for example, could you raise the child of your worst enemy the way that person would want their child raised? Not necessarily to hate you, but could you do that? But to achieve their own version of happiness and fulfillment as if it were your child. It's a similar process in the counseling relationship. Okay, and you want somebody, especially like if they're counseling your child, and you have to work through your own, why didn't I see this coming? Why did I give trust to this person, this authority figure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to be able to look at that, because sometimes it might mean breaking with your community or the community you've been raised in. So, if you didn't know, how could you find out? Could you make friends with members of that particular community? Could you love your enemy? And could you sustain your effort? So it's not just, for example, in drug sense, can you quit, but can you sustain your quit, even through persistent thoughts? Quitting drugs is easy. It's staying quit that's the hard part. Or whatever the activity is, the addictive activity is. So even though this is a civilian class and you don't want to think professionally, I'm just giving you what the behind-the-scenes professional standard is supposed to be, so that you can protect yourself. So let me skip the sustainability thing for the moment. Say again?
600 slides.
Yeah, we're not going to go through all of them. All right, internal balance. So this is a skill I want to develop. You all ride bicycles? Or have ridden bicycles? Yes? Okay. So bicycling develops the physical skill of balance while moving through different terrain and climate. I mean, I grew up in LA, so it never rains there, or rarely rains there. So even with the old Schwinn racing bike or the mountain bike, the idea of internal balance. Breath awareness develops the skill of internal balance of the mind and emotions while moving through different grounds of being. Or in emotional quicksand. So the reason I asked you about can you swim, do you have swimming skills? If you're in emotional quicksand, some forms of quicksand are quicker than others. Quicksand is basically there's water and there's a lot of sand, but it's not solid. But because it behaves like water more than sand, if you try and swim freestyle, you'll drown. It'll suck you under. If you relax and float on your back, the quicksand will support you and you can kind of scull on your back to solid ground. If you remember to not panic and don't struggle, which means you have to be aware of where you are. Ground of being. Right? Emotional quicksand. Can you swim? Do you have the skill to reflexively slow your breath down and relax? So techniques of swimming in quicksand, or walking on water, or going through the mud in murky water. So in terms of looking at internal balance, we have 3 popular technologies, one of which you only have name familiarity with. So I'm not a 12-stepper, but I recognize that, for example, in addictions treatment, 90% of the treatment centers out there are 12-step based. Unfortunately, and the reason I say unfortunately is that they don't necessarily look at the culture that generated 12-step treatment. Okay, the 12 steps originally of AA were started by 2 wealthy white men who were alcoholics, who were not sexually abused. So recovery isn't just simply giving up your drinking. Recovery, drinking's just the symptom. You have to be able to go to where the wounding happens, and if it's not in the 12-step framework, they will not deal with it. Okay, so what if your wounding is your sexual abuse? Maybe they will deal with it in treatment, maybe not. Maybe they'll say you're defocusing. What if your sexual orientation? That's the generator. There might be gay, lesbian friendly 12-step groups, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get that issue dealt with in treatment. And you've already seen what I've talked about in terms of dealing with racial issues, or what if you have all of them? So, EBP is short for evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is simply a scientist, either funded by a university or a government, studied a subject, made scientific findings, then another scientist replicated those findings, and those two findings finding the same thing, we can say it's fact. Now, that's not a bad standard for science, but do you think they're going to study sexual abuse and addictions? They might. Are they going to develop treatment for that? Who would be the better treatment, person to study that and then develop cures and practices within that? Would that be an evidence-based practice? You could look. That could be part of your research project if you wanted to do that. So that's what evidence-based practice is. So if the empire, because it's empirical data, that's another E in the EBP, if they decide to study it, then they've got data on it. So what if there's no data on it? Well, then you go to CDE, community-defined evidence. Okay, and what that is communities, however you define that, have their own way of asking questions and answering them. Globally speaking, HIV/AIDS is a heterosexual transmitted disease. Globally speaking. In Africa, it was between heterosexual couples. Everywhere the U.S. military has been, the U.S. military has spread AIDS in the sex industry in Asia, for example. Spread of HIV in Haiti was due to sexual tourism. Did you know that there's sexual tourism? That is Americans and Europeans going to a third world country and having sex with whoever for money. That's happening. With children. Okay? Spread of HIV happened in Haiti, and it also happened in Thailand, and et cetera, between the U.S. military and sexual tourism. So, but we used to think of AIDS as the gay disease, like that just because it showed up in that population first here, but not on the planet. Okay, so for the first few years of the epidemic, because it was associated with gay men, and gay men were low on the power totem pole in the country, we ignored it. They developed their own community awareness and prevention campaigns. Most notably, Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York and LA. That community then defined what the practice was going to be for everybody else. Here's what works. Knowing the infection status of your partner, so safer sex is not just with a barrier method, it's knowing the infection status of your partner. By laboratory test. Not just no glove, no love, but what's your infection status? Home HIV tests, et cetera, as a standard. Maybe that's not necessarily the standard you practice, but that came out of community-defined evidence. So, do you scratch the itch of addiction, or do you soothe the skin of the emotions with breath's lotion? I do have a poetic license. So, in terms of, this is an introduction to addictive behavior. So, one of the things that you look at